To learn more about democracy at work and the work we do, like producing All Things Co-op, a show that examines and explores the various aspects of co-op work environments, go to our website, democracyatwork.info. There you can also sign up for our mailing list, connect with us on social media, and more. Please stay with us. We'll be right back with my friend and today's special guest, Chris Hedges. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. I am very proud and pleased that I can bring back to our microphones and our camera someone who's become a friend as well as a teacher. Chris Hedges, you all know him, so I won't bore you with too many details. He's the author of 14 books, including several New York Times bestsellers. He's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who was a foreign correspondent for 15 years for the New York Times, where he served as Middle East bureau chief and Balkan bureau chief for that paper. He is the host of the Chris Hedges Report and a columnist at ScheerPost. You can find him these days at chrishedges.substack.com. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Rick.
All right, let me start. You're a journalist. You've been doing this for a long time. To me, and I want your reaction, the mainstream media coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been portrayed along the lines of a kind of holy war between good and evil. How do you see it?
Yeah, and I want to just throw in that I was in Eastern Europe in 1989 as a reporter, so I covered the collapse of the Soviet bloc in Eastern and Central Europe and the demise of the Soviet Union. There were two universal assumptions. One, NATO had been rendered obsolete. NATO was designed to prevent Soviet expansion into Eastern and Central Europe. And two, any expansion of NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany was an unnecessary and foolish provocation of Russia. In fact, Gorbachev was reaching out to try and build an alliance, a security alliance between Europe and Russia. And yet this understanding, and it was across the political spectrum, Henry Kissinger, George Kennan, everyone understood this, was violated, and it was violated because refitting Soviet bloc countries with NATO military equipment was a multi-billion-dollar bonanza. So NATO was expanded despite frequent protests by Moscow. And then there was an agreement with the Clinton administration that NATO troops would not be stationed in Eastern and Central Europe, and this was violated. And we talk about Ukraine, I think whether there's 13 or 14 former Soviet bloc countries that are now part of NATO. We talk about Ukraine as not being part of NATO. That's a bit of a subterfuge because they're a de facto part of NATO, given all of the military equipment that NATO has supplied to the Ukraine, coupled with military advisors. I think there were 150 NATO advisors in the Ukraine before the war, and now there's been this explosion of weaponry that have been shipped in from Europe and from the United States. I think close to $1 billion just from the U.S. alone. Germany has lifted its ban on the exporting of weaponry and then said it will almost triple its defense budget, and then use 2% of GDP for defense, which will make Germany the third largest military power in the world after China and the United States. So it's extremely foolhardy. I wrote a story in ScheerPost where I quoted a 2008 WikiLeaks cable written out of Moscow that warned that this would bait Russia into a conflict, and the flashpoint would be the Ukraine. So it was kind of like Gabriel Garcia Marquez's book, Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Everyone knew where it was moving, but try and provide that kind of historical context within the mainstream media, and of course you're shut out because you're right, it's all emotionally driven. It's It's about self-adulation. I mean, I guess after 2 decades of committing egregious war crimes in the Middle East, now we suddenly get to feel that we're the moral arbiter of the world. And I just want to be clear: I condemned at the inception the invasion of Ukraine, a preemptive war under post-Nuremberg laws, as a criminal war of aggression. Whether Russia was baited or not is not relevant. But our preemptive wars, Putin has a long way to go before he matches the war crimes that we carried out in countries like Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan.
Let me pivot a little bit. You've been writing about, as I have been too, but you've been writing about an American empire that is falling apart or is coming apart at the seams. How do you connect that argument you've been developing for some time with this war? Where does the Ukraine war and what's happening fit into that larger story?
Well, the loss of economic hegemony, the ruling elites are attempting to compensate for that loss with military hegemony. But I think if you look in the early years of any empire, they tend to use military force very judiciously and very carefully. But of course, this is a classic example of how military force is counterproductive. And we look at all of the debacles that have been carried out by empire. Go back to Vietnam, the wars in the Middle East, the humiliating retreat from Afghanistan, the retreat under the Reagan administration from Lebanon. It's been one debacle after another. And yet they keep perpetuating these kinds of military fiascos and are not held accountable. That is a classic kind of sign of late empire, and whether that is go back to ancient Rome or Greece or anywhere else. Read Thucydides. I mean, so and I think that wielding of military force without actually calibrating it or understanding the geopolitical consequences is a symptom of late empire. And of course, we are also baiting China in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, building security alliances with Australia to kind of hem China in. These are very, very foolish moves.
You know, I'm reminded, and I would wonder if you could comment on it. The sanctions are a kind of, how shall I put it, economic warfare as an accompaniment to the military warfare. And so I look at it, you know, I'm an economist, and I say to myself, wow, the sanctions are like an enormous supply chain disruption. They're going to have, they already have, the effect of driving up the price of suddenly broken trade agreements, suddenly broken delivery schedules. Prices are going up faster than they otherwise would have. The inflation is lasting longer than folks had hoped it might. This is not really the result of the military war so much as the economic sanction warfare that's going on. And it makes you wonder whether the end result will be a level of economic suffering by all those afflicted by inflation running faster than wage increases, by the price of food literally making people starve. You're beginning to worry or wonder who's going to, quote unquote, win this so-called economic war. And it may surprise us. If you remember, Trump told us he would win the trade war. He clearly didn't. And now we're being told we're going to win this sanction war. That's not so clear to me either. How do you see it?
Yeah, well, there are two winners. One is the arms industry, and we were all very foolishly in 1989 talking about the peace dividend and naive enough to believe it. That was never going to happen. They were going to continue to loot the state the way they did during the Cold War. And the other is the fossil fuel industry. You can't talk about war without talking about markets. And so you cut off Russian gas. Well, they've got to get it from the States. Europe doesn't like it because it's a lot more expensive. We can't pump oil out fast enough. And that gets into the whole issue of the blowback from climate crisis. So those are the only real winners. But yes, we as people, and then of course remember the Ukraine is a huge net exporter of wheat in particular. So, and all of this is going down the tube. So yes, and then I think we should talk about the by pressuring by imposing these draconian sanctions on Russia, we are accelerating the search. I mean, what the other irony is that we push Russia into the arms of China. So the whole Sino-Soviet alliance, the whole Cold War was built around putting up a wall between Russia and China. And of course now we've created this coalition, and what they really want to do is extract the dollar as the world's reserve currency. You're an economist, you know more than I do, but they're certainly moving in that direction. That's catastrophic for the U.S. economy. Go back and look at what happened when the pound sterling in the 1950s was dropped as the world's reserve currency, plummeting in value. Exports are exponentially more expensive. Nobody wants to buy treasury bonds. That's a really catastrophic blow. So yes, I think many of the moves that Washington and NATO has taken potentially are very, very counterproductive for them.
And that exactly. And you know, if we had time, I'd go into this stuff with the dollar and the fact that Russia's now demanding payment for oil in rubles, that they're linking the ruble to the gold value, which means they're putting a floor under the gold price. That shapes the United States. I mean, they're beginning to counter sanction, and we haven't even begun to understand where that's going to go on top of the first wave, you know, right. Because with Russia and China, the counter-sanction problem becomes a very serious one, which seems not to have been calculated. But hence my question, how do you account for taking these steps when they could be as counterproductive as you say? Is this a sign of desperation? Are we watching a Hail Mary pass here?
It's a sign of ineptitude. I mean, let's look at all of the policies, especially in terms of war, that the United States has embraced over the last few decades. It's just been disaster piled upon disaster. And yet, for this tiny cabal, arms manufacturers, the fossil fuel industry, private contractors, they make a killing. So what you've had is this kind of corporate coup d'etat. You service the profits and interests of these corporations at the expense of the nation, and frankly, at the expense of our democracy. And they're driving the country into the ground. And then if we talk again, go back to the climate crisis, the rest of the planet with us. So it's utter ineptitude and corruption on the part of a global ruling elite, which Julian Assange exposed through the leaking of all sorts of documents, which is why they are psychologically and physically destroying him in Belmarsh prison. I just came back from London. I was one of 6 guests invited to his wedding. And of course, when the 6 of us got to the gates of Belmarsh, none of us were allowed in, just part of the kind of sadism that defines prison culture. I teach in a prison. So yes, it is. But again, that is a symptomatic of late empire, where you compound problems through rulers who are so corrupt and so visionless and so inept that you, in many ways, become your own worst enemy.
Chris, in the time that we have, do you see any link between everything you've been saying and the upsurge of at least some degree of labor militancy inside the United States, whether it be in strikes or the unionization efforts? Are we beginning to see some level of recognition and pushback against what you've just been saying?
Yes, because the ruling elites, and it doesn't matter whether they're Republican or Democrat, have zero credibility. The established elites, because remember, there's a fusion now between the old Republican establishment, the Mitt Romneys, the Liz Cheneys, the Bill Kristols, and the Democratic Party. They are one entity, and they are opposed by this kind of proto-fascist, Christian fascist, cult-like worship of Donald Trump. But of course, their way to deal with it is through censorship. So I think on the ground, yes, people have realized that nobody in the ruling elite is going to watch out for their interests. They've got to watch out for their own. But take a look at my column, Let Us Now Praise Courageous Men and Women, that talks about how vicious the capitalist class is going to be in terms of breaking and destroying this nascent labor movement.
Chris, as usual, we've come to the end. I want to thank you very much for joining us. And to my audience, stay up to date with the latest from Democracy at Work. Join our mailing list. And as always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.